Hello, I'm Dr. Ramon Martinez. Today is February 7, 2018. I'm interviewing Linda Martinez and Joseph Martinez, who are the relatives of Josephine Guerrero from Milpitas, California.
Josephine's full name was Josephine Camarillo, and then she became Guerrero when she married Gonzalo Jake Guerrero.
I'm talking to you because I was looking for stories of old, long-time Latino, Hispanic families from Milpitas. I was on the radio asking for people to tell me about long-time Latino Hispanic families from Milpitas, California. I got a call from Louise Just, who told me that her mother and much of her family were longtime residents of Milpitas. Louise's mother is Ernestine Ann Santos Pimentel. You'll be able to see her story, just look for that name on one of the YouTube videos. Linda, Joseph, tell me about your parents, grandparents, where did they come from, what did they do?
My grandparents came from Michoacan, Mexico, and my mother was born in Michoacan, and an uncle and an aunt, and then the other two aunts were born in the United States, Topeka, Kansas, and also Chicago, Illinois. They came to Milpitas. They arrived when Josephine Guerrero, my aunt, was 2 years old. And they settled here. My mother was the middle child. Yeah, my grandparents came to the United States, and they moved a lot. I think they were here in Milpitas first, because my grandmother's brother was bringing in the labor for Spreckels Sugar, and that's how he actually became kind of well-to-do, because he would bring in all this labor for Spreckels. And but then they left. One aunt, Mary, was born in Topeka, Kansas, and then they went on to Chicago, where Josephine Guerrero was born. She was born in 1919, and they stayed there for a while. And the story that I heard from my grandmother was that they traveled around looking for someone to help my grandfather with his leg. He had an equestrian injury, and eventually they had to amputate his leg, and that really hurt him a lot. And eventually they went back to Mexico. And then he died, and the story I've heard is that he asked my grandmother to keep the family there together. They had a store, they had, I guess, some land and some livestock, and she said yes to him. But then when he died, she sold everything and came over to Milpitas to ask her brother to help her set up the kitchens to feed these men that were working for Spreckels Sugar. And that's how she made her living for a while. And the whole family helped my mother. She never allowed the daughters to go into the dining room when the men were there, but they would help her set up, they'd help her clean up, and she was a good cook. And her and my great-grandmother, and I knew my great-grandmother until the age of 9 when she passed away. She was a very colorful woman, and she helped also in the kitchen. And Josephine was 2 years old when they first came, as I mentioned. My maternal grandfather was named Jose Camarillo, and my grandmother's name was Erlinda Cervantes Camarillo, and my great-grandmother was Maria Cervantes. And at one time, she told me she knew when she was younger Emilio Zapata and Pancho Villa. And she used to tell me stories about that era. And my parents, my mother's name was Jovita or Jovita Camarillo Martinez, but everyone called her Betty. And how they got Betty out of Jovita, I don't know, but they called her Betty. And my father's name was Jose Martinez. And he came at the age of 16 from Mexico with a cousin by the name of Pablo Moreno. In fact, the people that were at the border named my father Moreno and not Martinez. And it was until he was here, more established, that he went and he legally changed his name back to Martinez. It's a very common name, Jose Martinez. But that was his name, and so he took that. And he came to work for my grandmother's brother, cutting the sugar cane for Spreckle Sugar. And that's where he made the acquaintance of my uncle, my mother's brother, Jose Camarillo. He came apparently to dinner at my grandmother's house, and my grandmother was very, very strict with her daughters. And I understand that when he came to dinner, he met my mother, and for my mother it was love at first sight, but at that time she was only 16, and he was 9 years older. So my grandmother and my great-grandmother would watch their eyes to make sure they weren't looking at each other too often. And so he made the acquaintance of my uncle, and they became friends. And at that time, my father was following work wherever, I guess, he could find it. And so there was a season where he went away, and then he came back. And my mother saw him again, and they decided to write to each other these love letters. And they found a place where they had a lot of morning glory. And he found a little cigar box, and that was their post office. And my mother said she would put her letter in her shoe, tell my grandmother, I want to go to the post office and see if there's any mail for you. And she would go and take the letter out of her shoe and put it into the little cigar box underneath the morning glory. And so out of that grew for about 3 years. They did this whenever they could, write to each other. And at the age of 19, my father proposed to her, and she knew that my grandmother, for some reason, my grandmother was a little strange. She didn't want her daughters to get married. And so she told my father that the only way she could marry him would be if they eloped. So they made their plans. And my mother made sure that day that they were going to elope that she said she put wax on the windows so that, the window could go up. And my father secured a ladder, and they waited until everybody was asleep, and they very quietly got out of the window, and then she left. My father had a letter from my grandmother telling her what they were going to do. They were going to elope and get married. And they drove in a little Model T Ford all the way to Bakersfield. And there my father had rented a house and had talked to the priest about getting married. And he bought my mother a wedding gown and everything, and they had a photographer. And he had pictures taken of the small wedding, because it was just her and my dad, and I think a witness and the priest, and sent it to my grandmother so that my grandmother would know that she got married and she wasn't just, a loose woman.
Now, the ranch that they met at was on Montague Road, just past the creek. Their little box that they served as their mailbox was under the mail, the regular mail box because in those days, those were seen by those, the post office treated them as individual mailboxes for whoever stayed and lived on the land. So there may have been 3 or 4 mailboxes on the street, and my parents used their little coffee box underneath the Morning Glory. Josephine was 2 years old when they moved to Milpitas. My grandmother bought a home just down the street from the school, so her kids could walk to school. And so Josephine went from 1st to 8th grade at this grammar school, Milpitas Grammar. And after that, she had to go to San Jose for high school.
Peter Burnett.
So she went to Peter Burnett. Okay, so Josephine went to Peter Burnett for high school. After that, she started working at a jewelry store, which was
Sam Pye's jewelry store, Sam Pye's, P-Y-E-S, in San Jose.
so that was downtown San Jose. She continued working that, and then she got also into owning a cleaners at one point. So she owned her own cleaners in Milpitas.
Milpitas Cleaners on Main Street.
Main Street.
Yeah. Her sister Mary had gone to work at a cleaners, and she became what they called a fancy presser for clothes that had a lot of pleats. And so those people, fancy pressers, were paid more, and so she wanted to open up cleaners. So they first opened up the cleaners together. But the two sisters, there was a lot of sibling rivalry, and they didn't get along too well. So eventually Josephine bought out Mary's portion, and Josephine owned the Milpitas Cleaners for many years. And then she went to work at the Milpitas post office, at first as a clerk. And then she became the assistant postmaster of Milpitas post office. Yeah, she went to work at she owned the cleaners first, and my grandmother had taught her how to sew, so she also did alterations for the cleaners, people from Milpitas. And it was quite successful. And then she met Jerry, and I don't remember Jerry's last name, who said to her, why don't you come and work at the post office? Jerry was, I think, the postmaster at that time. So she went to work as a clerk. And for a while she had the cleaners and the post office. She worked there full time, and then she would do things. She hired someone to help her with the cleaners, and then she would work doing alterations at night. And eventually it was too much for her. After a few years, she gave up the cleaners, and she stayed in the post office, of which she later became the assistant postmaster of Milpitas post office.
The cleaners was on Main Street next to the Milpitas pharmacy, which was owned by Sal Cracolisi.
The post office was a small building, a long building. One wall had all these little boxes, which were the twist kind that you had to have a combination. And there was the 2 little windows. And Josephine was there with Mrs. Peixote, who was actually a neighbor on the same street as my grandmother's house on Windsor Street in Milpitas. Then later, at first at that time, Milpitas was almost just one street. It was Main Street. Across the street was the Cozy Corner. And then later, they built a post office off of Windsor. So she was very close to her job. And it wasn't until much later that she was instrumental in talking to somebody, I think from Washington, D.C. and from San Francisco, to build the big post office, which now exists in Milpitas, which is on Able Street. I remember as a kid going to the post office to see my aunt, and then also going to the drugstore right next door for errands that my mother would send me. And must have been, 9, 10, 11 years old, I guess. And the post office was still there. And she, later, when I got my license to drive, she would give me errands to go pick up all kinds of things for the cleaners. She needed zippers, and she would send me to downtown San Jose on First Street, Mrs. Loewy's, I think it was like a supply house of some kind. And I would go pick up zippers and threads and whatever she needed to, because she still was working at night trying to do the alterations for the cleaners and work in the post office during the day. And lo and behold, later, then she became interested in Milpitas as in government. When Milpitas became, well, first of all, San Jose was going to annex Milpitas. And I think I was already maybe 17, 16, something like that, when San Jose with Phil Hammond was trying to annex Milpitas to San Jose. She became very active with that, and Milpitas, she led actually a group of people to fight San Jose and keep Milpitas all by itself to become a city. And she was very active with that and was very successful. San Jose did not try. They tried twice to annex Milpitas, and that they did not succeed. And then they formed Milpitas, the planning commission and everything, and Josephine became actually the first planning commissioner in the state of California, a woman planning commissioner. And she became the planning commissioner for the city of Milpitas, was very active. And she always wanted to have a library, because Milpitas at that time, when it was only a small town, used to have the mobile library. And people would get books or the kids would get books from this mobile library. And she thought that Milpitas, now being a city, should have its own library. And so she started that project. And she was a library commissioner for the city of Milpitas. She was also a library commissioner for the county of Santa Clara. And she became the chairperson of that commission. And she was a commissioner for many years. So she fought for that, and finally Milpitas had its own library. They used at one time, I forgot where the library was at one time, but eventually they used the old Milpitas Grammar School and established the library there. And they honored my aunt by giving her a room called the Josephine Guerrero Children's Activity Room. And there's a plaque there. And she was honored. She was part of the when they first dug up the first ground, and I have pictures of her with the shovel, with all the Milpitas dignitaries there. And so somewhere along the line, she sold the cleaners because it became too much for her. She became more interested in helping the community and helping Milpitas become a city. Josephine also became a notary public, and I remember going to her house to spend a little bit of time with her, but inevitably the doorbell always rang and someone wanted something notarized, or Jim Murray, the chief of police, would stop by. They were very good friends. He and his wife were good friends of Josephine and Uncle Jake. And also Don Edwards was a good friend of hers, and he would stop by. And so I'd go there and I'd want to spend some time with her, but there was always people in her home. And so I just learned that I had to share her with whoever was there at any time. In fact, Jim Murray and Don Edwards asked her to run for supervisor for the county. And at first she was interested because she's always wanted to help and was very community-minded and civil-minded. But she found out that you have to divulge everything about yourself. And there was part of Josephine that was a private person. And so she chose not to run for supervisor. But she still maintained all these friends in the city government. And she was still, I think, a planning commissioner and a library commissioner for many, many years. She was a trustee for Alexian Brothers Hospital in San Jose. And she was part of the grand jury for 2 years. And she loved doing all the civic work for the county and the city. She knew Jake, or Gonzalo H. Guerrero, from Milpitas, and I think from the minute he saw her, he fell in love with her. And when he went to the World War II, he was part of Patton's army in World War II, and he was in Europe, and they would write letters. And I've come across a lot of old letters that they used to send to each other. And eventually they got married in the late 40s. And so she was working at keeping her cleaners while they were married. And he used to work for a company that sold cinder blocks or cement blocks, and he would do the deliveries. And when Josephine became the postmaster and Milpitas became a city, he stopped working for that other company, and he became a carrier for the post office. He was carrier number 1. On his cap was a number 1. And he loved that job because where they lived on Spence Avenue in Milpitas, he knew all the people, and he was a very friendly guy, and people knew him from, all the women and the men liked him. He was a very friendly person.
Uncle Jake was a kid at heart. Even in his older days, he would take us places. They didn't have any children of their own, so Linda and I became a second pair of kids for them to deal with. And my parents shared us with them. So Uncle Jake would take me to Disneyland. He'd take me to the ball games at Candlestick.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember one day he would pick me up in the morning to take me to school. And before we got to the school, he said there was a game at Candlestick. Do you want to go? So I said yes. And so off we went to Candlestick for the game. And my parents didn't like that so much because they heard about it later. During junior at Russell School, they were a big part of my life, as they were in high school. I used to go after school. My first stop would have been to see Uncle Jake. And he would be home early from his work. I think around 3:30 he used to get off. He'd go home, and a lot of times he'd be listening to his LPs. When I got there, he used to lie in front of his stereo with the music blaring.
What kind of music did you listen to?
Big bands. He loved music.
And he taught us about that music too.
Yeah.
And
Well, they're all big band stuff.
Benny Goodman, Jimmy Dorsey, Harry, what was the guy, the trumpet?
Belafonte.
Not Harry Belafonte, no. Harry James, I think, the trumpet player. He loved him. And so he taught us about music from the 40s and I guess maybe the 30s, you know. Gave us an appreciation.
Yeah, he was a neat guy. Yes, I went to Samuel Air High School there in Milpitas, which was part of the East Side School District at the time. It wasn't until the city and the East Side School District parted ways did Milpitas come up with its own high school.
Joseph and I became Aunt Josephine and Uncle Jake's kids too. In fact, we used to celebrate Father's Day with both of them and Mother's Day with both of them. And we were as close to them as we were to our parents. And my parents, my mother's favorite sister was Josephine, and so she didn't mind sharing us with them. And it was to our benefit because my father was a pear grower and could not take us on vacation in the summer. That was his busiest season with the harvest and all. So that for us, going with Uncle Jake and Aunt Josephine many places in the summer and other times of the year was great. And Uncle Jake also had a boat at one time, and we went boating with him a lot, especially Joe. And let's see, he took us on seeing the missions of California, and they were just a fun couple to be around, and we really enjoyed our time with them.
Some of the places we went boating at were Anderson Dam, and also the what's it called in the valley?
The Delta?
The Delta. There's Frank's Track. I remember one place that had open waters. Yes.
We also went fishing with him, and her too. She went along, always had a lunch for all of us, and it was a lot of fun. And we also used to go visit a family, a very good, in fact, Josephine's best girlfriend is Teresa Maldonado from Torrance, California. And we visited them almost every summer, going to Knott's Berry Farm and Disneyland and wherever. And they had two sons, Eddie and Gary. And to this day, we're in touch with Gary. Not so much Eddie. Eddie is very busy with his business, but we still are in touch with them today. And that was her very closest friend, and we used to enjoy going down there all the time, Southern California.
Yeah.